The Torah tells us, "V'yikach Moshe atzmos Yosef." It's pasuk Yutes. Moshe took the remains of Yosef, the bones of Yosef, imo. Ki ashbi as bnei Yisrael lemor, because he had adjured the bnei Yisrael, saying, "Pokot yifkod elokim eschem," God will remember you. Va'alisem esatzosei mizeh yitchem. And when you leave Egypt, you will bring my remains together with your remains as we leave Egypt. So Rashi himself over here explains, so from this we learn, he says, you should remove my remains together with yours. So here it's indicated that not only were Yosef's remains removed from Egypt, that each shevet, each tribe, took the remains of its founder, of its antecedent. So the tribe of Reuven took Reuven's remains, and each tribe took the remains of the founding father of that particular tribe. Number of issues. Now, we read later that why did Yosef, we read about the Benos Tzlofchad. The daughters of Tzlofchad was killed, was put to death in the desert. There's a question, what did he do? He violated Shabbos. Did he violate the law of reaping, or did he violate the law of gathering, something that was growing? But he was put to death. And this was after the story of after the Meraglim, and after the Adas Korach, the story of Korach, they were swallowed up in the ground. So they said, and this is where the laws of inheritance are mentioned, that the daughters of Tzlofchad, he only had daughters, they came and they claimed that they have a right as heirs to receive their father's portion in Eretz Canaan, in the promised land. Moshe wasn't able to answer, so he asked Hashem, and Hashem says they're right, that if there's a son, the daughter is not an heir, but if there are no sons, the daughters are the heirs, and they have a right to inherit. That's the whole discussion there. So there, when it refers to the Benos Tzlofchad and it traces their pedigree, it traces it back to Yosef. So over there, Rashi cites the Chazal, the Midrash. Why Yosef? Because Yosef had Chavivus Ha'oretz. Yosef had special love for Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because we find that before he passed away, he said to his brothers, when you leave, you must take my remains with you. You must take my remains. So why did he want his remains to remove him from Egypt? That's Chavivus Ha'oretz, because he had special love for Eretz Yisrael, that even though he wouldn't be there in his lifetime, but minimally his remains should be buried there. So his granddaughters, the daughters of Tzlofchad, they also, because they had that special love for Eretz Yisrael, that precipitated that question, that claimed that they had a right to inherit the land. But if we're saying right now that when Yosef adjured his brothers, he says, when your remains are going to be removed, I want my remains to be removed together with yours. Itchem, together with yours. So if that's the case, where do we see that Yosef had a greater love for Eretz Yisrael than his brothers? Every one of his brothers. They gave the charge that when they leave Egypt, the Jews, after 210 years, as they leave, they should take the remains of their founding father. So Yosef is saying the same. So where do we see that Yosef's love for the land was any more than anybody else's love for the land? And yet, we trace the pedigree of the daughters of Tzlofchad to Yosef, that what precipitated that claim, the special love for the land, as their forefather had the special love for the land. Question I used to ask, Yaakov said, "Al Nosik bring Mitzrayim." I don't want to be buried in Egypt. Why? Because ultimately there's going to be the plague of the lice. The earth is going to turn to lice, kinim. Or at the time of resurrection, the bodies have to roll underground, subterranean, for Tchias HaMesim in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that maybe Yosef didn't want to be buried for that reason. And there's another reason given, because Yaakov didn't want to be deified. that after he passes away, he'll be deified. So Yosef didn't want to be deified. So I said in the past, no, Yaakov would be deified because when Yaakov came to Egypt, the famine ceased at that moment. Because when he came, he gave the bracha to Paro that when Paro goes down to the Nile rises up and it irrigates the land. And that's the reason why the famine stopped. So Yaakov is the source of all life. Therefore, Yaakov's concern will be deified. So that's the reason we have to say Yaakov didn't want to be buried in Egypt. But Yosef's not going to be deified. So if Yaakov is not going to be deified, so what's the reason? So why did Yosef want to leave Egypt? Even his remains should be taken out. He's not going to be deified. The answer is because of his special love for Eretz Yisrael. That's why, although he couldn't be there in his lifetime, minimally his remains should be there. But according to the reason that of resurrection, that he doesn't want to roll subterranean to be resurrected in Eretz Yisrael, or that reason, maybe that's why he didn't want to be buried there. No different than all the other brothers. So how is it indicated that he wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael to indicate his special love more than anybody else's special love? Because every one of his brothers wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. After the Torah makes it clear that Moshe was the only one who made the effort to locate the remains of Yosef. None of the other Jews. He was the only one. That shows that he was at a special level. What were all the other Jews doing when Moshe was searching for the remains of Yosef? Understanding that they can't leave Egypt unless they take the remains of Yosef with them. Everybody was borrowing the silver and the gold. Moshe was the only one who sought out the remains of Yosef because he understood you can't leave Egypt unless you have the remains of Yosef. And the Gemara in Sota cites a verse in Mishlei that Shlomo says, "Chacham lev yikach mitzvos." The one who has the wise heart, he's the one who takes the mitzvahs. Moshe, because he had that special wisdom of his heart, therefore he understood what was essential, what was primary, what was secondary. At this moment, primary is locating the brains of Yosef, because that's Chacham Lev Yikach Mitzvos. I mean, isn't a very simple? It's a simple issue. You don't leave Egypt unless you have the brains of Yosef. Yet Moshe was the only one who had that level of clarity that he's going to want to seek him out. I mean, what went through Aaron's mind? What went through Yeshua's mind? What went through Nachshon and Aminadab's mind? That he's the one who jumped into the Yam Suf before it split. I mean, we had special Jews there, but of all the special Jews, the only one who had this level of concern was Moshe, and therefore the Torah makes it a point. He's the one who took out the remains of Yosef. Right? What went through everybody else's mind, knowing this is a fact? You can't leave Egypt unless you have the remains of Yosef with you. Question in Rishonim, we speak about Moshe Rabbeinu's level of prophecy was ponim el ponim, that he prophesied in the wake state. When did that begin? Was that Sinai forward, or even at the burning bush? Moshe already was at a level that he prophesied in the wake state. It's not among the Rishonim. Now, why was Moshe able to prophesy in the wake state, and every other prophet prophesies in the sleep state? What's the reason? So the way it's explained, I mean, this is explained by the early commentators, that when a prophet prophesizes, the communication is to the soul. It's not through the human faculty. It's not through the brain. Because the physicality of a human being is not able, has no relevance to God's presence. So God attaches to the neshama, which is totally spiritual, not to the physicality. Moshe Rabbeinu, his physicality was so spiritualized, it wasn't considered an impediment or a blockage, which interfered. Therefore, the body itself was totally coalesced with the neshama. Therefore, he was able, even at the burning bush, to prophesize in a wake state. But what is that based upon? That's based upon Nachnumah. that the only person who was humble at Moshe's level, had that level of humility, he was negated totally to Hashem. If there's any aspect of your interest is, even as an infinitesimal amount, is you, that's a blockage. Moshe Rabbeinu, every aspect of his being was committed to God. If that's the case, there was no such thing as self-interest for Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, Moshe saw things with absolute clarity. It's true, you have 600,000 men above the age of 20. It's improbable or not even conceivable. His remains are not going to be attended to. But you understand, but there's an iota of conflict of interest. Here we have gold and silver, wealth, and we have the remains of Yosef, and which is going to be an impediment to go out. It's not feasible or even considered that somebody's not going to remove it. Moshe Rabbeinu says it has to be on an absolute level. As long as there is that possibility, it could be one in millions. Doesn't make a difference. Yosef's remains have to be taken out, but you have another mitzvah, and there's ways to see it. Moshe Rabbeinu had no basis not to see it right. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu is the Chacham Levi Yikach Mitzvos. He had the wisdom. He had that absolute clarity, and that's the point I made. Ezel Chacham and Roasa know that Moshe had absolute clarity because there was no blockage. He had no conflict of interest at any level. His interest was only one thing: do the will of Hashem. The will of Hashem is the Jews have to leave Egypt, and if that is an impediment for us to leave Egypt, where's Moshe? Moshe Rabbeinu is attending to the reigns of Yosef. But that's only if Moshe already had achieved the level of Nachnu Mo, that he achieved the level of negation at that moment already, even before Sinai. But if it was after Sinai, then it's not so simple. You have to say, because still, even though he wasn't negated totally, but he had a less of a conflict of interest because he was at a more advanced level within the context of humility. If you say he was there already, then it's easy. Every aspect of his being was only doing the will of Hashem. The will of Hashem is we have to leave Egypt. And that's going to be an impediment. That's what Moshe is. Nobody was at that level. And even if you say he wasn't at that level, but regarding the level of humility, which he had even at that point, at that time, nobody was the equivalent of Moshe. Therefore, he had that level of clarity, and therefore he attended to it, and nobody else attended to it. There used to be Sukkos. They traveled from Sukkos, and they camped in Esom at the edge of the desert. It's very interesting. Here they're traveling. Now, how do they know what route to take? Hashem led them during the day with a pillar of cloud, to lead him on the way, on the route. V'laylo, in the night, bamud eish, with a pillar of fire, lorelim, to illuminate for them that they should see where they're going. That they should be able to travel not only during the daytime, but even to travel even during nighttime. Meaning they traveled continuously. The pillar of cloud did not remove itself during the day. And the pillar of fire at night, before the people. God was holding our hands continuously. And the Gemara tells us that the pillar of cloud, as it was time for it to leave, simultaneously the cloud of fire came in, and when morning came, the cloud of fire was leaving. The pillar of cloud replaced the cloud of fire. There was never a moment that the cloud wasn't there, whether it was fire or was a cloud leading us. It's interesting. The Gemara tells us we have the showbread in the base of Mikdash, in the Mishkan. So it says the showbread is on the shulchan, and it says it has to be lifnei Hashem tamid. It always has to be on the table. Now, The Gemara tells us that every Shabbos, you had two groups of Kohanim. They had the outgoing group and the ingoing group. And when would they place the new showbread on the table, on the shulchan, on the golden table? It would be Shabbos. It would be Shabbos. And as they would take off the old bread, they put on the new bread. Now, how did they put on how did they remove the old bread and put on the new bread? So the Gemara says, since it says Tomid, the table can never be vacant of the showbread. So as they would be slipping off the old bread, they'd be slipping onto its place the new showbread. So there was never a moment where the table, the shulchan, never had showbread. That's what it was. Every moment it was there. Because the Torah says it has to be Tom, it has to be ongoing. It's interesting. The Amud Onon during the day, Amud Eish at night, there was never a moment lapse between one and the other. As one exited, simultaneously the other one entered. And as the other one actually moved out, the other moved in. There was never a moment Hashem was not holding our hand, leading us. There was never a moment the showbread did not have that bread on the table. I mean, what would be the common denominator between this and that? So I was thinking that the Gemara tells us in Bava Basra, if you want to be wise, when you say the Amidah, you should pray in a southerly direction. And if you want wealth, you should pray the Amidah in a northerly direction. Why? Because the menorah was on the southern wall of the covered sanctuary of the Heichal, and the golden table was on the northern side. The menorah represents wisdom. That's Torah Sheba'al Peh. So if you want to be able to draw from that energy of wisdom, you should go in that southern direction. The table represents Malchus, royalty. That's wealth. If you want to become wealthy, you pray in the northerly direction. That's the shulchan. That's royalty. Golden table with the showbread. That's the sustenance. That represents sustenance. Hashem, every moment that we exist and we're sustained, it's because Hashem is willing that sustenance. There's never a moment, there's never a lapse. It's a continuous, ongoing, contributing to our existence. That's what the showbread represents. So there's never a moment that table is ever vacant from the bread. Bread is the staple of life. That bread represents God's sustaining us on a continuous basis, the existence on a continuous basis. Because that's his level of concern, that every moment our needs are addressed. That's his level of concern for us. Just as the Onon, the cloud, there was never a lapse from one cloud to the other, leading us continuously. Yom v'loilo. That's what it's thinking. That's the commonality between the two of them. Yes, by Kriyas Yam Suf, when the sea split, the whole world knew about it. So there's a question, how do they know? So the Medrash says that, and Rashi cites the Medrash, that when the sea split, every body of water in the world split. Every river, and according to one position, that even the water in a vessel split. That everybody should be aware of Kriyas Yam Suf. But the Gemara tells us that when the sea split, the water normally flows on horizontal, it flowed vertically. That means it flowed thousands and thousands of feet up in the air. And all the nations of Canaan were able to see the water of the splitting of the sea. It wasn't something limited only to those who were there. Everybody was able to see it. What did that say? You don't know what it says. It says, it's a miracle. A miracle you could attribute to a lot of things, the miracle. It's witchcraft, who knows what it is. But when the Amud Onon led us during the daytime, and the fire at nighttime, when that fire led us, the whole world saw that fire. It's like you saw this, it illuminated the night for the Jews. Why did Hashem do it? Why? So the Medrash says, God is the creator. It's unheard of. He should lead us. It wasn't even an aid. He himself led us to tell the world to what degree God values Klal Yisrael, the love that he has for us. Why? Because he wants to tell the world the love he has for us, that they should treat us specially, treat us with reverence, with honor. As God, the Creator, leads us himself, they should treat us no less than that. So the Medrash says, not only don't they treat us with reverence and honor, they choose to kill us, and every conceivable death sentence they apply to us. Just to the contrary. So as a result of this is a basis for the culpability of the nations of the world for doing what they did to us. Because if they understand the Creator, the way he values us, and he himself does this, and that's supposed to be the takeaway, how do you mistreat us and do everything which is the antithesis of that? That's why he did this, to make it world knowledge that God is not hiding his love for Klal Yisrael. We find that the Mishkan is called Mishkan HaEdus, right? Because the Chet Egel, the first set of tablets were broken. Moshe comes down on Yom Kippur with a second set. It's called Luchas Shnios. He came down on Yom Kippur. And why was Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei, designated as the Day of Atonement? Because Klal Yisrael were forgiven for the Chet Egel. That's why it's called Yom Kippurim. However, Hashem says, the divine presence at that point still didn't dwell in our midst, because the Chet Egel, make for me this medium, through that medium I will dwell in your midst. So it's called Mishkan HaEdus. So Rashi cites the Medrash. Why it's called Mishkan HaEdus? It's the Mishkan of Testament. It's a testament to the world that Hashem forgave the Klal Yisrael for the Chet Egel. The world should know that the God dwells within us. That's an indication. Otherwise, they could say, like Christianity, what they say, the Jews were disenfranchised. After the destruction of Beis Hamikdash, they are no longer the chosen people. You're only chosen people if you buy into what they believe in. Therefore, they have a New Testament, lahavdil, from what we have. So the world could say, the Jews were that. They fell out of favor. No, Mishkan HaEdus. It's the Mishkan of Testament. God forgave the Jews for the Chet Egel. And we find, to mention it more, the only species which qualify for a korban is shor kesev eis. The first of the species mentioned is the ox. The ox is the egel. To tell us, to say that even though we sinned with the golden calf, and it's a species of the ox, nevertheless, that's the primary korban. That's the primary korban to Hashem. If the Jews were really that culpable, why did God say that is the first of the species that you bring as a korban? Because again, we didn't initiate it. The Chet Egel was initiated by the rabble, by the Erev Rav. We bought into it because it says Eila Elohecha Yisrael. It says this is your God Israel. Who's speaking? The Erev Rav was speaking. Therefore, as a result of that, the shor is the first species mentioned, which qualifies as the korban. So Hashem doesn't want you to even think for a moment that the Jews weren't fully reinstated. The world should know this. The Amora Onon and the Amora Eish, the world should know who's leading the Jews. To what degree does God value us? That the Creator himself leads us. So how should you treat them? How many plagues, how many miracles took place at Yom Suf? 50, 200, or 250? When the Egyptians pursued the Jews and they see the sea splitting, did they stop for a moment to hesitate, to reconsider going after the Jews? They went straight after them. I mean, we're talking about minimally 50 miracles are taking place there. 200, 250. How do you not stop for a moment and reconsider your position? Like Hashem leif paro, you'd say, God hardened his heart. A person that behaves irrationally. You attribute it to something else. It's a deity, it's this, whatever it is. I mean, here, it can't be clearer, and we don't even understand what the 250 miracles were. But whatever's happening there, everything happened in Egypt is not comparable to what's happening here. And yet, he goes with his chariot corps and his armies, they're going right after the Jews. So you see, a human being could be in a state of denial and be so focused, singly focused, that all you see is what you want to see. Everything else is totally blotted out. That's what you see from Chris Yamsuf. V'yidaber Hashem lo Moshe lemor, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, v'yeshuv yachnu l'fnei piach heroes, be'migdol ve'en hayom. Let them travel in the opposite direction towards the enemy, and they should camp between piach heroes, which is located between Migdol and Yom, l'fnei Baal Tzvon, before the Lord of the North. Nicho Sachno Aliyam. Opposite that location, they should camp by the sea. So they're traveling, usually you're fleeing for your enemy, you travel away from your enemy. Here they're traveling towards the enemy. And where are they traveling? The location where there's this deity, which is called Baal Tzvon. So Chazal tell us, we find by the Max Bechoros, it says not only did Hashem destroy the firstborn, but all the idolatry of Egypt was destroyed. It says that if you had a metal idol, it melted. If you had a wooden idol, it rotted. If you had a stone idol or it was made of plastic, it just cracked, disintegrated. The idol only represents the deity. Every deity was what? Was incapacitated, was no longer functional. But Hashem left one deity, which they worshipped. It was called Baal Tzvon. Why? To mislead the Egyptians. Let them believe, like we said, he left the wheat and spelt crop at a borod to make fools of them. He left this deity, again, to mislead them, that they should think that the reason why God did not destroy this deity was because God doesn't have power. So again, God is not the omnipotent one. He's not the almighty. Because otherwise, why is this deity still in existence? And proof in the pudding is the Jews, they're traveling in the opposite directions. Evidently, we see they're locked into the desert. But that was all to mislead them. That the Egyptians should even feel more emboldened, more empowered, that there's a chance that they're going to be the victors. And therefore, they're going after the Jews, even if they're going straight into the sea. This was all a decoy to mislead them, to ultimately to destroy them. So and the Jews, we see in a moment that we traveled towards the enemy. I mean, you're going straight back into the jaws of the lion over here. Rashi says, where is it? Lifnei Baal Tzvon, Huam Nisham Mikol Elohim Mitzrayim. This is the only deity that was left of all the deities of Egypt. Kedei Latosa Shem Koshi Rosa, to mislead the Egyptians, that to show the empowerment of this deity. V'olav Pirush Iyov Mashki Lugoyim Yabdein. God misleads the nations to destroy them, to send them into the oblivion. That was the purpose of this. The beginning of the Rashi, Beis Yeshuvu, Lacharem L'Tzad Mitzrayim, Hoyim Mekarvin Kol Yom Shlishi. The third day they were traveling towards the Egyptians. Kedei Lahatos es Paro, Sheyom Atov Heim Baderech. That Paro should say they're lost on the way. Okay? But all this is what? Only to destroy the Egyptians. V'amar Paro Livnei Yisrael Nevuchim Heim B'Oretz Sog Aleim HaMidbar. Rashi says Kluim. Nevuchim means they're imprisoned. They're entombed in the land. The desert closed on them. V'chizakti Eslei Paro. I will strengthen the heart of Paro. V'rodav Achreim. You understand? He needed a certain degree of what? Of empowerment. On his own, he couldn't have done this. According to Rambam, any rational person would have seen it clearly and say, I'm backing off of this. You lose 10 out of 10. And what you see, You stay away from it. You don't go near the fire. You're going to be destroyed. Chizakti. Because the Baal Tzifon is the only one left, the only deity, that proves, but you made the mistake before. You want to make the mistake again? The Chizakti is Leif Paro. I'm going to strengthen his heart. The Roda Vachreim, and he will pursue them. He will run after them. The Kovda Befaro Chochelo, and I will be glorified through Paro and all his armies. The Yoda B'Tzrayim K'nei Hashem, and the Egyptians will know that I am God. The Yasuchain, and the Jews did it. The Jews traveled towards the enemy. So this very important, Rashi. The Yasuchain, Lohagi Shvochem. That the Jews traveled towards the Egyptians, towards the enemy, this speaks of their praiseworthiness. Sheshamu l'kol Moshe, that they listened to Moshe's word. V'lo omru hech niskarvel rotfeinu. They didn't say, how do we go back towards the enemy? Anu tzrichim levroach. I mean, we should flee, not go in the opposite direction. Elo omru elonu el divrei ben Amram. Whatever Ben Amram says, we accept. It's interesting. It doesn't say elonu el divrei Moshe. Ben Amram. Whatever Ben Amram says, we listen. What's Ben Amram? I mean, what you mean? In yeshiva in Europe, people used to call one another by their last names. My Rosh Yeshiva, Zecharni V'rocha, he referred, like when you in West Point, Lahavdil, you say, Macintosh, not Mr. Macintosh or Master Macintosh. You call by your last name. My Rosh Yeshiva, Zecharni V'rocha, he used to refer to everybody just by their last names. By the last name. There's a story many years ago, Rav Eliezer Silver, Zecharni V'rocha, who then was in Cincinnati. He prided himself, he was a Talmud of the Rogachev and Rav Meir Simcha, Rav Eliezer Silver. So in 1941, he said a share in Baltimore. And then there were only 40 students in the yeshiva in 1941. That was a large yeshiva. And he said a share, literally quoted from all over Shas. And he was very strong in his position. And one student asked the question, which seemed to be refute the whole shir. Okay? So this shir that he said, we know there was one of the leading Torah sages pre-World War II, his name was Rav Shimon Shkop. And one was Rav Chanan Wasserman. And another one was Rav Naftali Trupp, who's the Rosh Yeshiva in Radin by the Chofetz Chaim. So when the student asked the question, so he said, he spoke a Lithuanian Yiddish. And a Lithuanian, he pronounces a shin like a sin. So he said this to Skup Trup Wasserman. Here he refers to them, not Rabbi. Skup, I said this to Skup Trup and Wasserman, and they didn't ask you a question. So evidently, your question is a baseless question. But that's the way he referred to them. That showed the level of relationship. It's not Rabbi. Skup Trup Wasserman. Ben Amram. What's Ben Amram? What are you pals? He's your palsy wowsy here. This is Moshe. Ben Amram. So I was thinking, why did the bondage start? Why were the Levium not part of the bondage? Amram, being the Torah sage, said to the Jews, he pleaded with them. Paro said, why don't you help me rebuild the country? So Amram says, you're making the gravest mistake if you show them your ability, as Yosef told his brothers. You shouldn't show them your capacity. You show them your capacity, they're going to enslave you. They're going to demand those quotas. They didn't listen. And because they didn't listen, therefore they were enslaved. The Levium, who were they were Amram's tribe, they did listen. And that's why the Levium were not part of the bondage, for that reason. They say, Ein lono ela ben Amram. Ben Amram, he's the son of Amram. The reason why initially the whole bondage started, the slavery, was because we didn't listen to Amram. He's the Ben Amram. If he tells us travel to the enemy, we travel to the enemy. Because that's the right thing to do. As much as we believe not that way, we're totally dedicated to the words of Ben Amram. That's what I was thinking. Sports, what they use and what they don't use. It's interesting. The Gemara tells us in Tainus, David, is very interesting, that if we talk about, what's it called? In Germany in the 1920s, there was a virus, what's it called? Where hogs, pigs, contracted a certain type of disease, like, what's it called? There was some kind of virus where pigs were affected by it. And people contracted that virus. David, what is it? There's a virus. Hog. What? Because it was known that many Jews who came from Germany in the 1920s, they had it and they recovered. But anybody who had that virus then, when they reached their 60s, many of them came down with Parkinson's. That was an effect of that virus, even though they recovered. They had Parkinson's. And people were very susceptible to this virus that affected the pigs, like you have bird flu today. Are people going to be affected by it? But so the Gemara says in Tainus that if there is the pigs are affected by a certain virus, disease, it's a time we have to start fasting and praying that the population should not be affected. Why? It's good. The Gemara says, and this has to do with medical today, because the intestines of a pig and the inner organs of a pig are very similar to a human being. And just as the hog is affected by this disease, and they contract it, the human being is susceptible to contract that disease. That's the Gemara. Therefore, when you see the herds of pigs or hogs being affected, you start fasting, that it should not affect the population. It's known that stomach transplants, heart valves, they use it, it's taken from a pig. There's a lot of the anatomy, the inner organs of a pig are very similar to a human being. I'm just mentioning it. So saying just to ingest a little bit, he has a tough skin. He has a tough hide. Like the pig has a tough hide. This person has a tough hide. Okay. Okay, that's the humorous part of it. We left off Kufay and Dalit, page 489. It was called some kind of fever. Hog fever, swine flu. David, swine
flu.
Swine, that's what it was called, swine flu.
No.
And I'm saying this is the reason. The swine and the human being, they used to call the Jews, the Nazis, Yemachshim, swines. That's what they used to call them, the Jew. But it was a very pejorative term. He's a swine. You don't say he's a rat, he's a swine. Because there was a lot of coming out between the swine and the human being. Okay. V'zedvar kara litzonim. What exactly are this group that called deprecators? Kara litzonim, scoffers. Nechlak litzonach achamisha chalokim. Scoffers, deprecators can be divided to five groupings. As I mentioned, the Shlom Melech Mishlei refers to Amalek, who attacked us after Kriyas Yamsuf. He refers to them as let's take. The scoffer, the deprecator, the only way you could deal with him, you got to smite him. Because if Amalek was not impressed, as all the nations of the world with Kriyas Yamsuf, where they trembled from Hashem and from Klal Yisrael, and they did not because they attacked us, that's an indication that they're deprecating means you don't have the capacity to appreciate value, and therefore you scoff and you deprecate it. So a person who's a deprecator, he himself has no capacity to recognize and appreciate something which has value. Who defames other people. No sin dofi. Kinyin shenemar teshiv bo'chicho tedaber beni mecho tite dofi. You sit and talk about your family, your brother, the son of your mother, and you say they have no value. You actually we're talking about character assassination. That's what it is. I mean, how do you talk about a person this way? I mean, you see, he has no value. What's his worth? V'nikra let shenema zayd yohir let shmo. Osa be'evras zodon. Posed mishlei. A zayd, we say hazaydim in the bracha la moshim al tisikvo. We say oivecho meiri karesu. The enemy should be cut down. Vazaydim hero sakir shabbos makir. If you say it in Ashkenaz, that's the Ashkenaz text. Hazaydim. So zayd is posed mishlei. Zayd yohir. The zayd is pompous. Yours is a balgaiva. That his classification is shmo. He feels he sits in his ivory tower, and he has a right to say anything about anything he chooses, to speak about anybody. That's yoyer. Ose be'ever zodon. He does it with a deliberate animosity, because he feels he can pass judgment, and he has this condescending attitude towards anybody who's not on his level, so to say. These two negative characteristics, which is deliberateness, you do something where it indicates you have no conscience, and gaiva, and it's arrogance. The let's, the deprecated, the scoffer has both of these negative characteristics. He has no sensitivity, that's no conscience, and he has gaiva. Even though he has nothing to gain, it's purely his arrogance that he goes and he defames and belittles other people. Yeah. He creates tremendous damage to other people. They cause the person to be seen in a negative light in the eyes of other people. Yavish. How does he word? Yavish means he putrefies people in the eyes of others. Let's see. Yavish. He tarnishes. He tarnishes others in the eyes of the public. It's worse than a person who deliberately steals or victimizes, shows the harbis moment. You do it for a purpose. Here it's just for the sake of what? Because of your arrogance, everybody is worthless, and therefore you classify people in this negative classification. Gamu yoyer, he's yoyer, he's pompous, he's arrogant, he's brazen. Person who's low, who submits, sheyakim igrasa atzmo. The person recognizes his own shortcomings. He doesn't speak about others. It's an expression. Those who live in glass houses don't throw stones. You're not so perfect. And if a person recognizes his own shortcomings, you're not passing judgment on others. To be continued. Okay. Rabbi Yosef had asked the question, even though Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai rescinded the original legislation that you're not able to accept witnesses after midday, but they never rescinded the law that the egg that's laid on the first day of Rosh Hashanah is permitted on the second day. So if that's the case, how could you say that after the rescinding of one law, it permits the other law? Because we have a principle, anything that's been legislated, unless it's been rescinded by a similar body, the law remains in effect. And where do we know this? And Gemara says, Omer of Yosef no amino law, dichsiv emor lehem shu lechem lo lechem. By Kabbalah Torah, although the Jews were not permitted to engage with their wives, the 3 days afterwards, Hashem says to Moshe, tell the people to go back to their families, meaning they're permitted in cohabitation. It says when the shofar, there's a question, Rashi cites two interpretations of the mishoch, either when you'll have a continuous blowing of the shofar, they're permitted to approach the mountain, or means means when the shofar ceases, then you're permitted to approach the mountain. Okay? And the Gemara will explain how it's derived from here, that once something is said, unless it's indicated, it no longer applies, you're bound to it, although the reason no longer applies. Okay? V'tan, we had mentioned that Kerem Avai, the first 3 yields of a fruit tree is Orlo. You're not permitted to benefit from it. It has to be destroyed. The 4th year, the yield of 4th year, it has to be taken to Yerushalayim. It has the same Kedusha, the same status as Ma'aser Sheni. Ma'aser Sheni, it's based on Gzera Shava. Ma'aser Sheni is considered holy. It's called Kodesh. And the only way you're permitted to eat it, you either in Yerushalayim or you redeem it. You actually transfer its Kedusha, take its value, transfer it onto money, and you take the money to Yerushalayim and you purchase food. It has to be a food item. Identically, the Kerem Revai, the 4th yield of the vineyard, you either take the grapes to Yerushalayim or you redeem it onto money, its value, and you take the money and you purchase food in Yerushalayim. So it's something the Torah says you're permitted to do. But nevertheless, there was a rabbinic enactment, that if you're within a day's travel of Yerushalayim, they had said, although on a Torah level you're permitted to redeem it and take its value, but the Chazal had said, no, if you're within a day's travel of Yerushalayim, we want you to take the produce itself to Yerushalayim, that there should be this abundance of produce in the markets of Yerushalayim, which is an enhancement of Yerushalayim. So what are the boundaries in all directions? Zui Tchuma, Min Adorom, Elas Min Adorom. This is what we call Elat. From Elas, from the south, Akravas Min Tzofon, Lud Min Mayrov, a day's travel from Lud to Yerushalayim on the western side, V'yardin Min Mizrach. And from the Jordan side, from the east to Yerushalayim, the produce, even though at Torah level you're permitted to redeem it, rabbinically, he says, no, you have to take the produce to Yerushalayim. Okay? So that's a rabbinic enactment. Because they wanted that the markets in Yerushalayim should be overflowing with produce, and this would beautify the markets. To see the affluence of Eretz Yisrael, the abundance of food, of produce. Why did they legislate this law that if you're within a day's travel, you should take the produce to the markets in Yerushalayim? To beautify, I don't know, Lati means like to coronate, to crown the markets of Yerushalayim with fruits. There should be abundance of produce in the markets. Okay? Now, the question is, what about after the Churban Abayis? So as long as the Beis HaMikdash stood, we want Yerushalayim to be seen in this special way. It's attractive. People are going to go there. They're going to feel privileged that they could be there because it represents something of like a royal status. But after the Churban Abayis, where the ones who are there are no longer Jews, and you're within a day's travel to Yerushalayim, this rabbinic law, does it still apply? Does it still apply? You say, what's the point? What's the point of taking the produce to Yerushalayim? There's nothing to enhance any longer. There's nothing to show any longer because our enemies are there. The Beis HaMikdash no longer exists. We'll see in a moment. But based on this principle, since this law was never rescinded, although the reason no longer applies, we're going to show in a moment, you still have to redeem the fruits. You're not able to redeem the fruits, you have to bring it. So the Gemara tell over a story in a moment. The Tanya, Kerem Revai Hoya Lo Rebbe Lezer, the Mizrach Lud B'tzat Kfar Tevi. Rebbe Lezer is the Rebbe Lezer of Yeshua. He had fruits, he had Kerem Revai to the eastern side of Yerushalayim in a town called Kfar Tevi. And he wasn't able to bring the fruits to Yerushalayim. So what did he do? He made an announcement that the poor are able to take the fruits. So Rashi says, because it was too difficult for him to travel to Yerushalayim, or to do whatever he had to do. We'll see in a moment. Therefore, he says to the poor, under normal circumstances, they're not permitted to take that. They're only permitted to take the gleanings of the vineyard, of the fields. But he said they could take this, meaning they could take the fourth yield. The fourth yield, they have a right to take. Amrul Talmidov, Rebbe. So they said to their Rebbe Lezer's student said to him, Rebbe, kvar nimno alecha ve'echa v'turua. Your colleagues, there was a consensus among them, and they permitted it. Meaning, you're permitted to redeem it. There's no reason for you to abandon it, to disown it for the poor. Because the reason of taking no longer applies, but more, he says, kvar nimno alecha chaverov. There was a consensus among your colleagues, among your peers, and it was what? It was rescinded. Who are the colleagues of Reb Lezer? Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai. So time of the nimna. What's the reason why there's no reason to disown it for the poor? Because it was ready, it was rescinded. Holo nimnu, but it seems to be if it wouldn't have been rescinded by Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, lo. So we see clear, although the reason no longer applies, although that's the background on the legislation, and the background no longer applies, but since they didn't overtly rescind it, it's still in place. So we see here, Davashim and Minyan, unless it's actually overturned, you're bound to it, although the reason no longer applies. So Rabbi Yosef asks, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai may have said that we accept testimony after midday, but the egg that originally was prohibited on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, on the second day, that was never rescinded. Although the reason no longer applies, does make a difference. So how do you permit the egg today? Because you accept testimony after midday, but regarding the egg, that application was never rescinded. That's Rav Yosef's question to Rabbah. Rabbah and Rav Yosef, they were colleagues. So that's the question he's asking to Rabbah. Rabbah said that today that we accept testimony after midday. As you accept testimony, the egg is permitted. So Rav Yosef says they rescinded only the law of testimony, but they never rescinded the law regarding the egg. So how do you permit the egg? David, go ahead.
Yeah, Rabbi, it's not the law of the egg. It's the law of the Kedusha, that it's a...
Okay.
The egg follows the Kedusha.
Correct.
It's not...
You're asking now, the Gemara will ask on Rav Yosef. They never prohibited the egg. The egg was only a consequence of the testimony.
Correct.
That's going to be a question on Rav Yosef. What are you asking? They never discussed the egg.
Right.
So if that's the case, the moment they rescinded the law regarding testimony, the law relating to the egg no longer has relevance. And that's going to be the Gemara's question on Rav Yosef in a moment.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, Tosas discusses this, and Rashi discusses this. When did Reb Lezer live? He lived after the Churban Abayis. After the Churban Abayis, the produce in Eretz Yisrael, did it still have Kedushas? Did Eretz Yisrael still have Kedusha? Maybe the Kedushas Haaretz, the holiness, that the fruits are holy, all that's only as long as the Beis Hamikdash existed. Once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Kedusha is no longer there. And if that's the case, the law of Kerem Avai no longer has any application. And since Rabbi Lezer lived after the Churban Abayis, and that, because you see, he was a colleague of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, and Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai rescinded it after the Churban Abayis. So if that's the case, why was Rabbi Lezer concerned that the law has application, the fruits no longer have that innate Kedusha? So the law of Kerem Avai, the yields of the fourth year, no longer have any relevance that they have to be eaten in Yerushalayim. That's Rashi. So Rashi answers that he was of the opinion that although the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Kedusha remains intact. Therefore, the fruits have that same level of holiness, Kedusha, and therefore the law is still in place. Therefore, he is not able to take the fruits of Yerushalayim. Therefore, he disowned it for the poor. But Tosas has a problem with this. So the question is, what are the poor going to do with it? Right? What do they do Yerushalayim? But the walls, you're only permitted to eat the Kerem within the walls of Yerushalayim. But if the walls are no longer there, you're not permitted to eat it. So what are they going to do with it? That's number one. So he answers that no, that if you have the opinion that the Kedusha remains, although physically the walls are not there, being in that environment of Yerushalayim within the parameters of the walls, although physically the walls are not there, you're permitted to eat there. Or he answers another answer that you're not permitted to eat it, even Yerushalayim. However, like this is very interesting. What's the halacha if you have $100 worth of Maisa Sheni? Let's see today. You have Maisa Sheni, and you want to redeem it on 1 penny, because it has to be redeemed on a minted currency. It has to be minted on a currency. Could you take $100 worth of Maisa Sheni or $1,000 of Maisa Sheni and redeem it on 1 cent, on 1 penny? So at the time that you were able to take the Maisa Sheni in Yerushalayim, you weren't permitted to do it. Post facto, if you did it, it's a valid redemption. What about today that we can't eat Maisa Sheni? We're not permitted to eat Maisa Sheni Yerushalayim. In Eretz Yisrael, what does the Rabbanot do? They do all the tithing. They take the Truma, the Maisa Sheni, they redeem it on a penny. You could have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Maisa Sheni. They take 1 cent and they transfer the Kedusha on that 1 cent. Why? Because today, what's the alternative? You can't eat it. So when do you have to transfer it on to value if the value could be actually expended in Yerushalayim? But if the value cannot be eaten in Yerushalayim, what's the point? Therefore, if you transfer it on to even a penny, it's a valid transfer, regardless of the value of the produce. So what Reb Lezer did, he said the poor can take it because he can't take the fruits to Yerushalayim, and he doesn't want to redeem it less than its value. He says, let them do it. And like as a result of it, they'll have all the produce for literally for a pittance to put it onto a penny. So we discussed when we learned Bava Metzia, we have the laws of Ono. If you go and you purchase something and you purchase it, the seller sells it where he's selling it for mistakenly for less than a sixth, more than a sixth, and he's not aware of it. It's not a valid transaction. That's called Ono. And here you could take $1 million worth of produce and transfer it onto a penny. Why is it a valid transfer? It should be a question like, oh no, it shouldn't be valid. You're shortchanging Hegdish. Hegdish deserves to receive what it's meant to receive. That we discussed this and when we studied the laws of Ono. So we answered, when you sell something, you're purchasing value. An item is worth $1,000. So up to a certain point, when you pay the owner for that amount, then he releases the ownership. Something that's consecrated, it's not, the ownership is based on its status of Kedusha. When you transfer Kedusha, Kedusha can be transferred onto anything of value. So even though ultimately Hegdish is receiving something less than the original object that was consecrated, but what is the process of transferring, changing the status of something that's consecrated? You just have to take off the Kedusha. So anything which qualifies to transfer Kedusha onto it, it's a transfer. So you can take $1,000 object, transfer onto a penny, it's a valid transfer because it's not, the way you change its status is not by paying for its innate value, it's by taking off the Kedusha. So if you're able to take the fruit, the produce to Yerushalayim, you're doing the wrong thing. But today that you can't eat the fruit in Yerushalayim, so all we have to do is take off the Kedusha. So as long as you take an object which is qualified to transfer Kedusha onto that object, which is a minted coin, we transfer the Kedusha from that enormous value onto even a penny for that reason. That's the rationale. Okay. So there's an interesting Tosas here on the bottom. We're saying that any law that's legislated by a certain qualified body of chachomim, rabbis, the only way it could be undone, could be rescinded, it has to be a similar body of chachomim who rescinded. Okay? And even though the reason no longer applies, nevertheless, unless it's rescinded, unless it's undone, it remains in place. So Tosas discusses a case here. We're on Hey Amid Aleph on the bottom Tosas. Kol dav shebin tzorch min yachelatiro, yeshor etzem lomar, mikan de'osem charoma she'osem lizman ad pesach. or Zman Acher. Now, let's say people, the Bezdin of a community says that from Sukkot to Pesach, anybody who crosses this line will be excommunicated. They give a specific time. The Bezdin of the community says, the rabbis, that Jews have to behave in a certain way for the next 6 months, and if they cross those lines, they can be excommunicated. And now the time passes, it's beyond 6 months. They never rescinded it. Do we say that since it's legislated for this period of time, unless they undo it after 6 months, it remains in place? Or we say no. Since initially they said 6 months, so once the time expires, the excommunication no longer applies. That's the discussion of Tosis. So some want to say that anything that's legislated, even though the time expires, it remains in place. And what's the takeaway from us? From what the Gemara is talking about over here? That even though the reason doesn't apply any longer, we see unless it's rescinded, it remains in place. So similar regarding this law of excommunication. So let's read inside. Yeshua wrote in Lomar, Mishkan, they want to extrapolate from our discussion here, the Osen Charamos, those laws of excommunication, She'osen Lizman Ara Pesach, which is in effect from a certain period of time till Pesach, O Ad Ach Zman Acher, you need another body of rabbis to rescind the law, although the time expired, and they originally said an amount of time. Hashem says before Kabbalah Sator, for 3 days you're not permitted to engage with your wives. B'Shomat Torah, because the Torah is going to be given, they have to receive it in a state of purity. So if that's the case, it's understood. The Nidna Torah, that after 3 days the Torah was given to us, the Mutarim, that they're permitted, because the only reason is to receive the Torah in a state of purity. Vaval Pi came, but nevertheless, we say Hashem went. He Elohem, he said, Moshe, tell them to go back to their wives. But if the only reason why initially we were not permitted is because we have to be in a state of purity, so now the Torah is given, why does Hashem have to say go back? Meaning you're permitted in cohabitation. So similarly here, even though there was a time period given, we see it has to be undone. Similarly here, even though you said the excommunication period is until Pesach, unless they go and rescind it, it remains in place. So Tosas is going to explain in a moment. One thing has nothing to do with another. It's a misunderstanding whatsoever. Why? Velohi docha ein kan shum zman dikro. They nechonim shloshis yomim. When Hashem says prepare yourself, something's going to happen in 3 days. Prepare yourself for the receiving of Torah. Hazminu atzchem ledovashi lesof shloshis yomim. Prepare you for something that can take place in 3 days. And therefore, don't engage with your wives. He didn't say, for 3 days, you're not permitted to your wives. Hashem never said that. Prepare yourself for something that's going to happen in 3 days. Why? If Hashem would have said, be in a state of preparation for 3 days, a 3-day period, you should be in the state, then it would be a proof to what we're speaking about. Just as you have to permit them to go back to their wives for cohabitation, so you have to rescind the time of excommunication. But the Torah doesn't say that. It says prepare yourself for something that takes place in 3 days. God did not say that cohabitation should be permitted after 3 days. That's what you understand. Prepare yourself for something's take place. Therefore, you're not permitted to your wives. What's going to be after 3 days? We'll understand if that's why can't we go back. But Hashem never said that. He never said you go back after 3 days. It's our understanding why we should. But since he never said you're permitted, unless he says you're permitted to go back, you're not permitted to go back. You're not permitted to approach your wife because something has taken place in 3 days. Now it takes place. But God never said you go back. The mashwa, the olomis, You should not go back to your wives. He didn't say set a certain date. He gave you a reason why. But you're able to understand, based on your understanding, it should be permitted. No, since he said you're not permitted, unless he goes and rescinds it or qualifies it, you're not permitted. But if you set a time that excommunication is in effect for 6 months, that means after 6 months, it's no longer in effect. So once that time expires, the excommunication is no longer in effect. Therefore, they're not comparable one to the other. So here, out regarding the egg, Rabbi Yochanan Zake says, we don't accept, he didn't speak about as long as the Beis Hamikdash stands. He never said that. They originally said because there was an issue that the Levium said the wrong parak of Tehillim, the wrong Shira, we don't accept testimony after midday. That's all he said. It was happened to be in time of the Beis Hamikdash. Now the Beis Hamikdash no longer exists. You understand? But they said we don't accept testimony after midday on Rosh Hashanah. As if that's the case, they didn't say as long as the Beis Hamikdash exists. Therefore, now the Beis Hamikdash doesn't exist, although we understand that's the reason. But since that's the way it was stated originally, therefore it has to be rescinded. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan said, Yozaki said, now going forward, that we no longer have Beis Hamikdash, you're permitted to accept testimony until nightfall. Okay?
But Rabbi, when you take that $1,000 of Meiser Sheni, and now that the Beis Hamikdash doesn't exist, it's you can transfer it to a penny. Okay, so you couldn't do it before. You couldn't,
even when the Beis Hamikdash did exist. If a person did the wrong thing, and he made the kind of transfer,
you don't do
valid,
it.
It's valid. It's valid. Even time of the Beis Hamikdash, it's valid. It's not, we're saying it's valid because the Beis Hamikdash doesn't exist. You're not doing anything inappropriate. But even time of the Beis Hamikdash was valid.
Right.
Therefore, it didn't have to be rescinded regarding the transfer of the value.
So now that the Beis Hamikdash doesn't exist, and now it's 4 p.m. on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and the Eidim didn't come. There's no Beis Hamikdash, there's no carbon.
Would not be permitted to accept testimony after midday.
Okay, so if you can't accept it, so now we know for sure.
That's what he said. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, why can you accept testimony? Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, we originally said we're rescinding it. Going forward, you can't accept testimony. But what do you need it? If the only reason is because the Beis Hamikdash, because of the issue with the carbon, there's no carbon. It doesn't make a difference because they never said because the Beis Hamikdash exists, that's why it's in place. They said, we don't accept testimony after midday. Finished. That's what they said. So unless you rescind it, it remains in place. Rabbi Yochanan says, now that we no longer have Beis Hamikdash, I'm rescinding it. So if that's the case, you accept that, you're permitted to accept testimony until nightfall. Okay? Marcus, he's shaking his head.
Got a lot of things going on here, Rabbi. I'm shaking my head because Audrey asked me a question.
Okay.
So now that we accept
the recipe, okay, we just spoke about eggs. Okay. Good.
Got a big shot was coming up.
Okay.
So now that we accept testimony all day, we're back to the same concern that maybe is it Yom HaRichta or is it Suffolk? It's a Suffolk.
We discussed that. That's
I know.
Hold on. In Chutz La'aretz, that's always 2 days.
Exactly. It's a Yom
HaRichta.
Right. Right.
We have to get back to it. It's complicated.
Yeah.
That's what yesterday. No, not what you're saying. It's complicated. In Eretz Yisrael, do they always have to keep 2 days Rosh Hashanah today? Or no? They have to keep 1 day. Or even when you keep 2 days, is it like a Sveka Yoma or is it Yom HaRichta?
I know.
Very extensive discussion among the Rishonim. I just want to leave it for next week because it's really complicated. Okay. Let's go further. Now the Gemara is going to address the psukim. What are the verses? We cited 2 psukim. The first about regarding Kabbalah Torah cohabitation, and then another pasuk that when the shofar ceases to blow, you're permitted to approach the mountain. Permitted to approach the mountain. My Omer, the Gemara cites two psukim. That Dovasha B'minyon, anything that's legislated in a certain context body of rabbis, you need a similar context to undo what originally was said. You know, there's a Gemara in Megillah. You know, we have Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is on the 9th of Av. What's Tisha B'Av? We commemorate the destruction of Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yochanan says that if I would have been there when they legislated it, I would have what? I would have had it commemorated on the 10th. Why? It's more in Tainus. Why? Because they torched the Beis Hamikdash right before sundown. But it burnt. The majority of the destruction actually took place on the 10th. So if that's the case, we should commemorate on the 10th, not on the 9th. Because it was only torched right before, the torching took place right before sundown, which is the 9th. So that the Gemara says, even though the actual burning was on the 10th, but what caused it? When they ignited on the 9th, basically was destroyed. It just had to evolve in its destruction. Therefore, we commemorate the destruction on the 9th, not the 10th. So Gemara says in Megillah that they wanted to change the Tisha B'Av from the 9th to the 10th. So Tosa asks a question. Since factually it was legislated on the 9th, and we have a principle that anything that's Dovasha B'Minyon, whenever anything's legislated, you need a similar body to change it. And the body that changes has to be as great as the original ones who originally enacted it, legislated it. So what's even the consideration to move it from the 9th to the 10th? That's Tosa's question in Megillah. But there was a consideration, and they said, no, we don't do it. For the reason that we said, because the torching took place on the 9th. So Tosa says something interesting. What's the halacha that if Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos, when do we fast? We fast on Sunday. Why do we fast on Sunday? Because one doesn't fast on Shabbos. But Sunday is the 10th. The 10th, if it's a question of the 9th or the 9th is a better date to commemorate it. But the 10th also has relevance to commemorating the destruction. Why? Because it actually burnt on the 10th. So therefore, since the 10th has relevance to the 9th, even if the body of law are not as great as the original ones, we could switch it. Because basically, the 10th is connected to the 9th. To change something that what originally was represented shouldn't be, unless you're of a similar body of greatness, you can't undo it. You can't rescind it. But over here, when it comes to Tisha B'Av, the 9th or the 10th has relevance to the 9th. So therefore, maybe we don't have to meet that criteria that the people who want to rescind it or alter it don't have to be as great. The Gemara says, no, they do have to be. But why that was a consideration there and not anywhere else.
I mean, we see Allah, out today, practically, that there are a number of stringencies that we still apply until the 10th till Chatzos. So we do.
That's the reason. That's the reason. But since in actuality, burn on the 10th,
right?
Therefore, we don't eat meat or we don't take a haircut until after midday.
Yeah,
on the 10th for that reason, because actually it burnt on the 10th.
Yeah. And Rabbi, how do we think about this idea in the context of, let's say, Ezra HaSofer? So now we have decrees which annulled certain things.
Okay, let's talk about the Gemara says in Avodah Zarah that if a non-Jew touches the wine of a Jew, you're not permitted to drink the wine. So the Gemara says, why? The reason is because of libation. Wine is used for libations, like idolatry. But not only that, it's because since wine is a social beverage, it's a preventive for assimilation. So therefore, if a non-Jew touches the wine of a Jew, it's off limits. Initially, they wanted to legislate it regarding olive oil. Since olive oil is a staple, right? Especially if you have a Mediterranean diet, right? You're a Sephardic Jew. So olive oil is a staple in cooking. So originally they wanted to legislate that if a non-Jew man produces or touches the olive oil of a Jew, you're not permitted to eat it or benefit from it. But it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because it was a gzeira, it was a rabbinic stringency which was too much for the people to handle. And as a result of that, it doesn't apply. So there's a machlokes rishonim, something they legislate, and it's based on a misevaluation. Do you have to rescind it or don't you have to rescind it? Do we say that since it was mistakenly legislated, it doesn't need any rescinding? Or do you say no? Because it was done, once they legislated, it's in place. But because they saw it was too difficult for the people to deal with it, when they realized, they rescinded it. And that's a machlokas. Okay, now, the Gemara says in Brochus that Ezra legislated, talking about Ezra, that a Jew who actually has a seminal discharge or even cohabits with his wife, he's not permitted to study Torah. Why? Because at Kabbalah Torah, we're learning that men had to separate from their wives. So unless you go and immerse yourself in a body of water, 40 so of water, after you cohabit, you're not even permitted to learn Torah, or you're not even permitted to say brachas, but to daven. Because just as the Torah, it had to be in that pure state, today also. But they saw it was too difficult. Later, they saw that Ezra's Takona's legislation was too difficult for people, and we revert back, even if a person cohabits with his wife or has a nocturnal discharge, he's permitted to study Torah. It's the same discussion. There, it's a little different. Why is it different? Because there, it held for a while. People were able to deal with it for a while. So well, for a while, therefore, they rescinded it. However, or because they originally said, if it ever comes to a time it's too difficult, we don't want it to go beyond that point. By the oil, the olive oil, from get-go, it was a misevaluation. And because it originally was misevaluation, it was a mistake. Here, by the cohabitation, it wasn't a mistake. The original generations, they could handle it. They could deal with it. But later, when they saw they couldn't, so initially they had said, if it should come to a time where the people feel it's too difficult, it initially was saying it doesn't apply to that particular moment. Okay? That has relevance to this discussion here of Davish Minyan.
Yeah.
Do you need Minyan Chalatir? Does it need rescinding or does it not?
That's interesting. And today, don't we hold it like that he can substitute of the mikveh, that if you're under a shower for a period of time,
Even if you're not, it's
you,
that the Gemara says Tisha Kabin. If you have a certain amount of water continuously go on you, but even that one doesn't need. The Rambam rules it's better to do it. It's better to do it. If you could, you should. So it wasn't rescinded the way where it has no value. It has value. But at one time, it was not permitted. It was a rabbinic prohibition. Okay. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to do Rambam, Hilchos Tefillah. Okay. Okay.
Oh.
Let's see the Rambam. It's you and Mark this morning.
I have to go to shul, but I'm listening, Rabbi.
Okay. Mark, we're doing Hilchos Tefillah.
I'm here. Okay.
Okay, terrific. We left off the Rambam. It said that minimally you have to pray 3 times a day. Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv. If it's Shabbos Yom Tif or Rosh Chodesh, you have 4 tefillos. What's the 4th? Musaf. If it's Yom Kippur, you have 5. You have Shachris Mincha, Shachris Musaf Mincha, and you have Ne'ilah. So Ne'ilah is the 5th. Right before sundown, you have Ne'ilah. And you're not permitted to have less than that. However, the Rambam says, what about if a person on a personal level wants to add another tefillah? It's called tefillas nedava. It's a voluntary tefillah. If a person, as long as he adds something, a supplication or request, which he did not say in the previous, he's permitted to say it. He's permitted to offer a voluntary tefillah. You're permitted. The Shulchan Aruch rules, let's say today, a person feels the first tefillah, chakras, he was distracted, and now he wants to pray better, with more focus, more intensity. And he's going to pray for the same things. He has a big business deal coming up, and he felt the first chakras, he didn't pray hard enough. And he wants to say another Amidah to pray harder. Is he permitted? So the Shulchan Aruch rules, that if the person himself, when he prays this voluntary tefillah, he will be focused and not be distracted from the first word till the last word, he's permitted. But if factually, he could have a repeat of the first time and he's not going to be that focused, then you're not permitted to offer a voluntary tefillah. Voluntary meaning has to be a quality voluntary tefillah. If it's going to be deficient, if it's the tefillah you're obligated to pray, even if it's deficient, it's okay. But if you're adding, you're only permitted to come and have that audience, again, only if it's going to be a quality audience. If it's not a quality audience, you're not permitted to come. You're not permitted to add that additional tefillah. Okay? So now the question is this. During the week, tefillah and davar is permitted. What about on Shabbos? Let's say on Shabbos, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, if you want to bring a personal korban, were you permitted to bring a personal korban? You had a burnt offering, a peace offering, a toad offering. Were you permitted to bring it on Shabbos?
No, it was only Karban Tzibur.
Oh, good, terrific. So the whole concept of Nedava is a personal offering. That's personal. Shacharis corresponds to Talmud Shel Shachar. That's communal offering. Mincha corresponds to Tefillah, to Talmud Shel Beit Abai. It's communal. Ma'ariv is you're burning the limbs of the communal offering. But what about your personal offering? Musaf is communal. What about you want to offer a voluntary tefillah? Voluntary, that's personal. Personal, that you can't do on Shabbos or Yom Tov, because there's no personal karbonos which are brought on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Okay? So let's say a tzibur wants to offer a voluntary korban. The whole concept of voluntary by tzibur has no relevance. A tzibur is always what they're supposed to do. So that's what the Rambam rules. Ein atzibur spalin tfilas nedova, lefisha ein atzibur meviin korban nedova. There's no such thing as a tfilas, a korban nedova, a voluntary korban. The korbanos, the sacrifice that brought in the Beis Hamikdash, is because the Torah legislates you must bring these korbanos at these particular times. V'lispal afilu yochid musaf shtayim. Person wants to say musaf twice. He feels the first musaf he pray with enough kavanah, and he wants to pray another musaf. Achas chova, v'achas nedova, fishin misnavin korban musaf. There's no such thing as a voluntary musaf. Musaf represents a communal offering. V'yeshmin agonim mishahoresh osel spalo tfilas nedova b'Shabbos yom tovim, and that's what we rule. There are a number of the gonim from the Gonic Pirk said, even on a personal level, you want to offer a tefillas nedavar, you're not permitted to do a Shabbos and Yom Tiv. Fishay makriv men nedavar, because on Shabbos and Yom Tiv, there's no such thing as a korban nedavar, a voluntary korban. Ela chovas heim b'levad. Chagigu you bring on Yom Tiv. Olas Ria, the burnt offering you bring in honor of the Yom Tiv, that you do. But let's say you have personal korbanos you want to bring. On Yom Tiv, it can only be on Chol Hamoed. You're not permitted to bring those korbanos on Yom Tiv. So therefore, a tefillas nedava, which is the equivalent of that, which is the equivalent of a voluntary korban, you're not able to what? To offer the tefillas nedava, the voluntary tefillah on Yom Tiv, even though you'll have that focus and the kavanah, it doesn't make a difference. Now, we refer to the Shemona Esrei as Shemona Esrei. Initially, they had legislated you have to say 18 brachos. Later, something happened that added a 19th bracha. The bracha l'mal shinim, that we pray for the destruction of the informers, of the enemies, of all the deprecators of the Jewish people who put us in jeopardy. We pray for their destruction. That bracha of l'mal shinim was not initially part of the 18 brachos. It was not part of it. B'mei Rav Gamliel, Rabu Habikursim Yisrael. Time of Rav Gamliel was the prince of Klal Yisrael. There were an increase of Abikursim heretics among Jews. Boy Matzira Yisrael, and they brought tremendous pain and suffering upon Jewish people. This is similar in Europe. You had the Haskalah movement. You had the Enlightened movement. They did whatever they can to undermine the Jewish community. And they went and informed on them to the government to try to do whatever they can to destroy all aspects of Judaism. They wanted to turn it into a culture. It's Jewish culture. There's no such thing as God. Umesisin osan, and they went after Jews to try to discourage them to abandon the Judaism. These heretics. The Kevin Shiro, Shazu Gedo, Kevin Shiro, Shazu Gedolim, because Tzorche B'nei Odom, and since so this was a moment of need, more than any conceivable need for Klal Yisrael. Omad Hu Ubezdino Viskin Brocha Achas. He and his Bezdin and his rabbinic court, they went and legislated an additional bracha for Shmon Esrei. This is the 19th bracha. Shetia bo sheila milifnei Hashem. It's a supplication before Hashem. La'abed habikursim, to destroy this group of people, these heretics, which are putting Judaism in jeopardy. V'kovosa batfilo, and they said that this additional bracha should be part of the Shmon Esrei. So we have 19 blessings. Kedei shetia arucha b'fikol. Why did they put it as part of Shmon Esrei? Because just as the Shmon Esrei people are actually, although we said earlier that people are not fluent in Hebrew, but since there's a uniform language, text, everybody becomes familiar, everybody's familiar with it, without leaving it up to people, just as the Shmon Esrei people are familiar with it because they say it day in and day out, this blessing is not left up to the person. The text was authored also by Rabbi Gamliel and his Bezdin. Nipsu kol brachos shebetfilo chashrei brachos. So today it's no longer 18 brachos, we have 19 brachos. Okay? So although we refer to Shmon Esrei in Hebrew means 18, but they're 19. It's 18 because initially it was legislated and authored by the Anshe Knesset Gedola. At that moment, it was only 18. Rabbi Gamliel and his Bezdin, they added the 19th. Now, the Gemara asks, where did they come up with the number 18? 18. So the Gemara says in Megillah that a person has 18 vertebrae in the spinal column. 18. And when you say the Amida, it's with supplication, you bow. You realize if your spine would be one solid bone, you couldn't bow. Because there's no give. But because the vertebrae, actual one is separate, you're able to bow. Otherwise, you'd have to bow at the waist, straight down, like a rod. But we're able to bow to bend, our backs are pliable. So because there are 18 vertebrae in the spinal column, and the Amida is totally subservient to Hashem, therefore, the 18 vertebrae correspond to the 18 brachos. So Mar asks, so now that we added the 19th, where is it alluded to that you can add the 19th? So on that, the Mar answers that there are 18 large vertebrae. At the base of the spine, there's a small bone, which is smaller than the others. So the 19th bracha corresponds to that smaller bone. So there is a basis for the 19. Initially, there were 18, those are the primary vertebrae. But there's an additional vertebrae, which is smaller, which is not as noticeable as the other. So the 19th bracha corresponds to that. So it's interesting. In the Lamalshin, we say, our enemies should be quickly cut off. And the Zaydim, so similarly, Oyivech means our enemies, the non-Jews. Zaydim are what? These deprecators, the one who are out to undermine Judaism. From the Rambam, it seems to be that the primary reason why they legislate this bracha, because these people, these heretics are out to undermine Yiddishkeit, to destroy Judaism, to take people away from Judaism, which was, if you read the history of the Enlightenment movement, the Haskalah, that's exactly what they did. They went after Jews to take them away from, there's a group of people in Israel that they're out to take religious youth and do whatever they can to take them away from Judaism. I forgot what the organization is called. And it's very serious. And because they're having tremendous inroads in the Jewish community. They're showing him the pleasures of the world, what they're missing, what they're being denied. So when you say the bracha, as the Rambam says, Rambam Leal, they had similar situations in his time. So within the bracha of Malshinim, it includes those people. So you should have in mind these people. Hashem should stop them in their tracks and what, and they should not be effective whatsoever, and they should be destroyed. Okay, we're going to stop here. Daf Yomi is at 9:30. Okay, everybody be well. Mark, have a good day. Mark? Okay.